Well, let me welcome you all, and we're absolutely delighted to have you here. So I'll give you a little bit of a history. I approached the Arup Foundation, and with the idea that we were concerned about our capacity as engineers to innovate, and therefore we wanted to continue these think tanks, but now focus in a much broader sense in engineering, and we wanted the first think tank to be centered around innovation. The conclusion of the group was that big question of how do you educate people that are capable of innovating, and so that's what brought us to where we are today. The format of the workshop is completely open. It's up to you to decide how you want to drive this discussion. So I'll leave it there, and I don't know if anybody has any comments or any questions, and we can get started from there.
The idea that engineering as part of a social contract of society has a responsibility to promote professional equity. Engineering is not the only profession that has exhibited the capacity to do that. I thought when you were talking about it, particularly of the nursing profession, you actually think in particular that engineering does have such a social responsibility.
No, I mean, again, I've come back to where I started this meeting yesterday morning. I mean, of the different frames of interpretation you could choose for why a profession exists, it seems that equity would be one of the very best. If not, I mean, so yeah, I very much believe that. And I think we are inheritors of a tradition of that. I think we are inheritors of curricula that at one point maybe had a lot more to say to that.
I would probably say there's no argument. I cannot see the point of being an engineer that isn't working for society.
Right. Sort of society has no expectation of engineers. I mean, you know, when we talk about sort of medicine and law are kind of these things that we're holding up as, right, professions. And there is a set of social expectations, right? Society expects doctors to behave in particular ways. We expect lawyers to behave in particular ways, and we mock those who don't, right? We do not, and certainly not in the U.S., have any kind of set of social expectations of engineers other than, you know, got me one of these things now, guess some engineer made that, and isn't that nifty? And
is engineering a profession like a doctor or lawyer, where your first allegiance is to the profession, and a set of ethics or something that distinguishes the profession from simply having a job as an engineer? In law, it is to the concept of justice. In medicine, it's an ethic of care. And it's basically human welfare is what most of the engineering ethical codes, if I'm remembering, claim.
Coming back to education, thinking about what my students, but you know, I have these kind of discussions with them. Well, why are you coming in? Why do you want to do engineering? You know, what is the point of all of this? And they are, many of the ones that I speak with are deeply motivated. They're certainly motivated to make a good living, but they're deeply motivated to solve, I think, the problems of the systems that they've inherited. Climate change, environmental remediation, and, access to clean water, access to communications, digital divide. These are the things that, largely unprompted, they will generate to a degree. And that's one of the questions I ask about innovation is, does it ask fundamental questions about society? Mm-hmm. Or is it always sort of accepting, well, these are the constraints that are laid down, and we don't really question those constraints because we've already got so many sunk costs into this technology, we're just going to keep it moving.
It's that sort of ability to constantly look outside your own frame, right, and constantly be saying, oh, what are the architects doing? What are the industrial designers doing? What are the microbiologists doing? And being able to sort of continue to look at those other people, other fields, and maybe it's not even just fields, people who live in a different place, people who live in a different community, and continuing to reflect on that. And I think one of the challenges about engineering education that you counter in the workplace by always bringing new people in is you become insular. And that's really what, like when I think about our university and, mechanical or chemical, you take fewer and fewer classes as you go through with other people, and it's more and more the same 50 or 100 or 150 people in every single class in this narrower and narrower way. So you're not encountering new ideas.
Is it that today we've got to a point where we see the concept of innovation just purely and simply as fixing
Right.
the gaps within an existing framework? And that framework is just getting to a point where we should be questioning the framework, but instead we're putting all our energy in just trying to keep fixing it in a constant way. And the people that we're educating, the people that we're putting out, they're being trained to effectively just continue to do this.
That's what they're sort of trained to do is, here's an objective, you need it. But there's also the ability to think around, outside, to question that objective and say, is that really the objective we want? And what are the implications of that objective and how does it work? Both at the large scale of, should we be building these spaces, and at the small scale, should they be fostering groupings of 3 people?
Something about the term invention, and then we moved on to innovation, that it is so much power. It's got a lot of momentum as a term, and I think part of that momentum means that it very well does hide discussion of the externalities. Achieving innovation is this locomotive moving in one direction towards some point that you can never reach. When I think we all know that innovation exists in regulatory frames, in health frames, and environmental frames. So what is it about innovation, the term, as it's being deployed in education, let's say, that allows it to hide so much of this other kind of discussion, this framing discussion around power and values? Because if you lose the criticality of it, then you're just turning out engineers who believe that they are just one more generation of people going out and moving towards the great positivistic truth.
This is a question that's been really troubling me in the U.S. because all of the, and they're correlation studies, right? All of the correlation studies will show that your high school math scores are what are most predictive of your success in a U.S. engineering school.
Yeah, it would be in the UK too.
But that sort of implies something about engineering that I'm not sure should be true. So because part of what then becomes is like, oh well, so then we just need to use math score as our filter.
Right.
It's like, okay, but should that correlation be the thing that drives it? And what you're saying is we get a different kind of engineer.
Yeah. You get a much more whole. I mean, I would say it's lazy engineering.
There's been a couple of comments about engineering being this precise thing and you know what the answer is. And I just don't identify with it at all. If I think about, and I was always brought up about the art of engineering, that's what we did, certainly not the science of engineering. If I think about what I've been discussing around projects I've been involved in recently, it's the probability of a ship hitting the Fremantle Bridge. There's nothing precise about that. It's about the patronage to the new Cross River Rail, motor vehicles being rerouted in different places. Nearly all, and if you look at a geotech engineer, I mean, he gets a bunch of test results which looks like a shotgun pellet distribution. He draws a straight line through it somehow. Flooding models. There's just so much what we do is nowhere near precise. So I really struggle as to why it's perceived as somehow as being this precise thing. The science end of it is, but that's a really, very small part of what we do.
Question that perhaps neglects the long and very important history in many engineering fields of not some sort of flat innovation or creativity for profit, but innovation for social good or for beauty, but also justice, public health, and various other frames and imperatives that have been quite important in the history of engineering.
I mean, it seems to me sort of educationally, part of what is missing or what is not happening is that understanding of context and questioning and what else might be going on. But part of that has to be about recognizing that, oh, I'm going to go into a community that I'm not part of that may have things that I don't know, and perhaps I need to talk to local people in the community, and perhaps I need a sociologist, and perhaps I need a government specialist, you know, somebody who does public policy to think about this more deeply. Like sometimes I think a lot of what happens right now when we train engineers, and I see it in a lot of my students, is the notion that they're the engineer, they can solve the problem. That's what they do.
But
right?
that is a really interesting point that you're making, because effectively if you have a cost-driven model in which success is equated in who makes it cheaper, that makes all the more important that the engineer has a much broader vision of the problem, because otherwise engineers are being encouraged to be delusional. They think they can fix all the problems, solve all the problems, and do it at a penny.
Why?
And,
Engineers think they know everything. Medics don't. Medics are amongst the most humble people in the world that you can ever meet. It is precisely because they know the limits of their competence. And the fact that in 5 years' time, half of what they learned is going to be out of date, and they don't know which half. That's a favourite expression in medical schools, and they tell it to their graduates. Who ultimately sits at the top of this? Well, it's a collective. It's a self-regulating collective of minds. There's no single individual within the organisation that will claim that kind of intellectual superiority, or it's a different model of doing things.
Yeah, I think we should shine light on these moments when they realized that they actually had, this whole time, they actually had a pretty large amount of social capital. That they were much more capable than they realized as political actors, as moral actors, to a certain extent. But I think part of, if you're looking for sort of broad systemic change, part of it has to happen exactly this way within these professions, not waiting for some regulator to come in and say, well, you were supposed to, your CSR rubric is not good, and you didn't pay enough to the community, whatever. I'm not saying we should relax regulation. I'm saying that this is potentially a way to talk to young engineers about the unexplored potentials of their profession. They have more social capital, they have more, that taking on that responsibility actually puts them in a more powerful position within society.
The other analogy with medicine is fascinating, because I always used to question this analogy, because we wondered why problem-based learning didn't take off quite as much in engineering as it did in medicine. Why is that? And I thought, well, the person comes with an ailment. It's so much more contained. It isn't, of course, because there are social conditions that might cause that illness. There's all sorts of other political, social, cultural issues. But you got this person in front of you. And with engineering, you just don't have that person. And if the person does front up, then basically there's no conversation that happens. The people that
If you do pro bono legal work, you are working for a person who has a problem, needs legal representation. If you do basically a medical clinic for people who don't have the resources, you are doing something for a person who has a health problem or a family member who has a health problem. What is the analogy in engineering? Is the analogy is easy to make? Are we working with humans or are we working with systems? For the most part.
But there's a third reason why people do these things, and it has a very practical interpretation. I mean, the biggest problem that medical schools face is exposing the students to the widest possible range of clinical material. And you only get that by precisely going out into the bush, putting up clinics, sending your students out there, because they see a range of clinical conditions that they would never see in a metropolitan hospital. It's the same with law. It's a way of bringing teaching material to train the next generation of graduates.
Think about this. We did a study, a student did a study of a civil engineering infrastructure transportation sort of fairly large project. I mean, it was an urban infrastructure railway project. And people's ability to work in that environment successfully and effectively was still very connected to the degree to which they understood the context in which their work was happening, because it had a lot to do with how people were able to respond well or not so well to the inevitable disruptions. right? And so individuals' level of frustration and irritability and annoyance went up in inverse proportion to the degree to which they understood sort of how and where they fit in.
I think what you're getting at is, am I digging at a physical level, am I digging a hole?
Right.
Or am I digging a hole to
Right.
build this to help someone? So
And,
do you see the whole
and then
picture?
where it came out was, no, you need to dig the hole over here, or the contractors did this, or we just got this pushback from the politicians and this is gonna change. And it was, your response was either, well, this is annoying and this job is totally miserable and I'm having a horrible time, or no, this is, you know, the economics and this is the culture of we're trying to build a rail system. And I don't mean to say like the happy worker, but it sort of affected morale and productivity and some of those kinds of things.
It's a metaphor of pathways. There are multiple ways through this. One needs to develop one's own path. And I would say the value of education, if you think of it not as a factory process, but as an ecosystem, is diversity, because diversity gives an ecosystem resilience.
Alan asked the question, well, then who's got the big picture at that point? And where does the buck stop on sort of the social and ethical orientation of a firm? I mean, when you get more aggregated and perhaps you get more sophisticated, what's lost in the balance? And we seem to have thought that one of the things you do lose is big picture thinking, perhaps social dedication, ethics that might run through the entire discipline or the entire profession, because you can sublease and sublet various parts of that. Yeah.
And it's interesting because that specialization, just as you were talking, right, so is built on this notion that information is hard to access and hard to understand, right? So you need an increasing number of specialists who are good in a thing, right, and a narrow thing. But in fact, technology has shifted the world in such a way that all that information is readily accessible. We're operating as if there were no internet in some ways, as if that accessibility was not there when we drive to narrower and narrower specialties.
Actually, the world is looking for, one of the things that I think the world is looking at is an increased awareness of complexity. And a lot of what we did in the 20th century was to sort of cut things down and look at them, slice them up smaller and smaller and smaller so that we could understand them more and more deeply. And that's fine, and that's great. So we understand very small things, but actually we need to put them back together again. And maybe when we put them back together, it's a different order. And I think the education of the 21st century is around how we build that way of looking at the world, with putting the pieces together in a different way. And we need to educate people to be able to do that.
Describe as we create silos which we need for organisation, learning, all sorts of things. As soon as you've created them, you've got to go about the business of breaking them down as well.
When you create a profession, you create a boundary. Because there are those who were in the profession and those who are without. And to me, this idea of within and without is becoming more problematic. Because Norman Fortenberry, who's at ASCE now, did a study a while back where he looked at all the recommendations on diversity in engineering from the 1960s onward. And every single blue ribbon panel came up with exactly the same 6 recommendations, none of which have been implemented effectively. And I wonder if a part of this is engineering saying we are a profession, and we build these professional walls, and there's very high stakes to get into this club. And we've done it for status, and I'm wondering if making that boundary more porous is something we need to consider, and if the first place to do that is not within the university.
There's something very powerful, though, with this idea of having a more porous boundary between the end of university and one's career. Because, and I say that for several reasons, if people can go through that boundary more easily, you get more networking. You get more idea that you're doing peer learning. But it basically drives a value proposition. So instead of it being some kind of a push process where you push people, say, no, you have to go back, is what if you make the university a place that pulls people back in, that it's an opportunity to take some time out, to develop in a new way. It's not something that's required, but something that you would want to do because the environment of the university in some way changes, right? And that becomes a metric of success, being the number of places our graduates go. But I think we have diversity issues we're not even aware of yet, or that the voices who do see them are not being heard in the larger discourse. And I don't think it's only around diversity. I think student voices are something that we don't listen to really nearly as well as we should. How do we look broadly and identify where the holes are?
To me, the kind of rather simple-minded place to start is that the classroom and the faculty have to look like the world in which it exists.
What I would like to do with engineering students coming in, where they actually get to seriously understand the very nature of the construction of knowledge, that we are responsible, somewhat in universities, I think, in creating the knowledge for the new generations. I mean, yes, of course we create it in industry too and in other places, but universities do create knowledge and ways of thinking and skills and capabilities, but also knowledge. And that does change the way we think and the way we act and, you know, what we do with our lives.
And we're not a company. A university can't make the next computer chip or build a bridge or build a highway because we simply don't have the research for it. But we can do things that show ideas have merit.
But we got to this point yesterday about engineering,
Right.
where we were talking about, well, what is the point of engineering anyway? Is it to have disruptive ideas and argument about those things and that get to values? We can keep alive the opportunity that ongoing debates around technology and values are there. We should, and I think we're at this point now today of our discussion of higher ed. I mean, to your Alan, your point. I mean, what's the point of it all? I mean,
Right.
is it just to carry on, you know, or is it to actually bring disruptive ideas into the curriculum, into the research, or whatever it is?
I mean, I'm a great believer in the end you have life experience, and you know, this thing called a university is not some magic place that guarantees anything, really. I mean, I think, because actually, if you think about it, that's what this is all about. It's how you're going to make choices throughout the next 100 years of your life.
But you choose by trying.
And you choose by trying, and all we really do in a university is give you opportunities to choose. We're just very bad at enunciating that that's actually what we're doing, because we pretend actually we're going to make you a very good civil engineer or we're going to do something else. But actually the real reality is we're educating a person, not thing. And people make choices.
I'm always a little bit troubled about all this idea of the choice. Is that when students come into the university, we've already made 9 out of 10 of choices for them. And we constantly do that. And I believe that one of our big failures is that we should be empowering them to make a choice. So when they come in, we shouldn't tell them this is what you have to take. And what you really want is to enable people to be capable of following the rest of the process. I'm a firm believer that the entry point should be the decision of the student. They should decide what they want to do and what is necessary, you know, for them to be able to establish what is the path they want to follow.
So, but I would argue that some students can do that better than others, and so then so unless you are providing also the support and the mentoring, you're going to be advantaging some people and disadvantaging other people.
But I understand that, you know, I've been, 35 years trying to make a choice, and I'm still not there. You know, so I'm very bad at it, and I know that. And but that doesn't prevent you from continuing to recreate your own existence.
Right.
And I think the empowerment that individuals need to be able to define their own destiny is something that I think our university system is really not geared for. We're not empowering. What we're doing is telling people what to do.
To me, what's interesting is there's the education process is a big range. It's from the school, it's your years here, and then there's a bunch of education afterwards. Within that time frame, you've got to learn your trade. You've got to become an engineer. You need to know your core tools at some point. You have to understand the impacts of it all the society stuff. You understand the business and management. There's a range of things you've got to do. And it's all about when is the most appropriate time to do all of that. And part of it is what you've been touching on now, and that is the decision points. At the moment, I think far too often we expect people to know that they're going to specialise in a certain aspect of a certain discipline when they leave school, which is utterly unrealistic.
And I think this question of when we're in higher education, whom we serve, is a very important one. Do we serve industry?
Do we serve the parents of students? Do we serve our disciplines? Do we serve the students? And the answer is, of course, we serve all of these. And I think we don't always realize that these different services have tensions built into one another. And to me, the unit of analysis has to be the student. That if we don't believe that people have agency and the freedom to choose their own path and can develop the wisdom to do that, we're all screwed anyway, right? And so I would argue that if you have to look at who to serve, we might start with the student.
We were throwing around the wild idea of kind of like a mentorship education. I've seen various models like this where, so for example, I really want to learn about what you're talking about. You become my teacher. You advise me that maybe there's a great course here or a great course here, or maybe I should read these books. So it is a sort of self-directed education program. What would it take? A group of academics from around the world to decide to create a multiversity.
It's an uberversity.
Uberversity.
It's a sort of Uber university thing. So it seems to me that's quite an interesting idea. The more I think about it, it's quite an interesting concept because it is completely and utterly dynamic. And the benefit of an Uber taxi network isn't the taxi, it's the network. And you can, in effect, you can pick your pieces of your different sort. You can choose. That sort of flexibility has completely transformed that piece of the transport market. And thinking about it over the last day or so, I sort of think, well, actually, maybe we should just get rid of all buildings and stuff, and have that sense that you can construct the piece of education that you want.
The value of education is not to produce the same graduates of a level of quality, but the aggregate of graduates who in sum have a set of skills needed going forward, but have enough difference in their skills that some are going to thrive in this unpredictable future because they have some agency in their own pathway to education rather than being forced into this particular set of outcomes. And I think at some level that's the model that you're proposing, to say understand the world, understand how you want to change the world, and from that select a set of competencies, if you will, that will allow you to do this. And so now we have the idea of a university rather than a physical infrastructure and space and buildings as a university of a network, a connection of NGOs and companies and people who are centered around this idea of human development. And it may involve a physical space, but it's not the university quadrangle and the library and the administration building that is
that could be a bit of it, but it's part of, to me, it's the university of the mind. Maybe that's what we should have.
So the essence of what you're saying is that we are advocating to completely change the focus from the institutions and the industries those institutions serve into the actual individuals.
So it's the person that's accredited, not the institution.
Yes.
As much as we like to think often in higher ed that we're building these very permanent structures and permanent curricula, the world outside gates imposes itself on us in ways that at times have been highly generative of new concepts and new forms. And I think, just listening to my students, we are in one of those moments now. We are in a moment where people talk about crisis and nobody says, oh, you're over the top. I mean, sort of constant global warfare, climate change, sustainability, the decay and collapse of infrastructures, fundamentally engineering-oriented problems with engineering-oriented solutions. This is that moment. We are living in a crisis moment. And I think it's important that we own it. I like the ecosystem analogy, and sometimes the ecosystem gets out of balance, but that can be generative of new forms if we survive.